Hello and welcome to our third SHOTPROS webinar today. My name is Valerie and I'm responsible for the dissemination and communication in the SHOTPROS project. I will now briefly introduce our speakers who will inform you about the topic of VR training concepts today. And our first speaker is Dr. Vana, who is Assistant Professor at the Vrije University of Amsterdam. And the second speaker is Lisanne Kleygrewe, who is a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. They have a lot of experience in the topic and will shed light into the VR training concepts and in theory and practice. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function. Our speaker will do their best to answer all of the questions, and I will hand over to them now, and I really hope you enjoy the webinar.
All right, Valerie, thank you so much for your introduction. My name is Lisanne. This is Vana.
I'm Vana.
Yeah. And first, I would like to give you an impression of what our role within the SHOTPROS project is and what we're responsible for. So in general, our expertise is more in the training concepts and new innovation approach. And we were tasked with providing an overview of current training practices of the current curricula in European law enforcement agencies. We're also developing, or we have already developed, a conceptual human factors model of decision-making and acting under stress and in high-risk situations. And Vana will present that in just a minute. And lastly, we're also tasked with developing a European framework for training and assessment using virtual reality. So this will happen in a few later stages. So today, as I already mentioned, Vana will present the conceptual human factors model to you. And after that, I will give you a little bit of detail and background on the actual field experiments that we've already done. Some of which we actually tested some virtual reality systems with police officers. And I think I will give the floor to you now. As Valerie already mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to us. We'll do our best to answer them, and we'll keep a log of them. So the ones that we feel are relevant to answer in the moment, I'll just give you a heads up, and all the other ones, hopefully we'll have enough time to answer them at the very end. So.
Thanks, Lisanne. Yes, I'm good here. Good afternoon, everybody. Before I start talking you through the model we developed for the SHOTPROS project, I want to get us a bit into the mood for this webinar. And I sent you in the questions box, I've sent you a link to a clip that I would like you to see. And what I would like you to do is watch this clip of a police arrest that is going different than expected. And after you've watched it, if you could provide via the questions button some input why you feel that this is a stressful situation. What is making this situation that we're about to feel stressful? So I'll give you a minute to go to the link and watch the clip, and then watch your answers of what you think is making this, this situation stressful. Go ahead. So if you've managed to watch the clip, please, via the questions box, give me some input of ideas you have why this was a stressful situation, which factors was making this arrest situation more stressful and perhaps influenced the outcomes of this situation as well. All right, I guess I'll move on after this brief introduction. And I think this clip illustrates that under stressful circumstances, things changes. It's not that these are horrible police officers, quite the contrary. I think these are well-trained, well-equipped police officers, but due to the unexpected circumstances and perhaps the stress that is present in that situation, things are a bit different. So I think it's a fair conclusion to say that stress changes things. And in this webinar, I will use this simple sentence of stress changes things to kind of ease you into our conceptual model for the SHOTPROS project. But let's first look at why it is important to have such a model to begin with. The aim of SHOTPROS is to eventually train police officers to do their job under stressful circumstances and then proper actions and decisions under stressful and risky situations. And we believe that therefore it's necessary to understand the human stress response, to understand the impact of stress on perception, decision-making, and action, and to understand mechanisms to mitigate the stress response so we can maintain our performance despite the fact that we are stressed. And that's the whole idea why this conceptual model is an important underlying basis for the SHOTPROS project. If we start with this easy small sentence of stress changes things, let's first focus on what stress is, and then on what we believe to change under stressful circumstances, and then go into the things that we believe change under stress. And I think it's important because everybody has probably an idea of what stress is, and we know what somebody means when they say they're stressed. But having a clear definition of what we consider stress might be helpful. And stress is defined as a disbalance between perceived demands and perceived capacities. So if I feel that the demands to cope with the situations are bigger than my capacities, then the beginning of the stress response will start, because I don't feel equipped to deal with the requirements or the demands of the situation. For stress to occur, it's not just this disbalance, but also the fact that it's stressful to well-being. So if I'm not able to cope with those demands, then my well-being will be harmed, or is at risk at least. Also, I experience no coping or limited coping, and there's no control, or I experience limited control over the outcomes. So that would make a situation stressful when I perceive this disbalance between demands and capacities, which is harmful to my well-being, over which I experience no control, and I have limited or no coping possibilities. So that would be our working definition of stress in this model. That is influenced by several human factors, and they were distinguished as personal factors, contextual factors, organizational factors, and social factors. So these influence how I perceive the demands and the capacities, whether I experience control or coping possibilities, etc. So that would be the stress part of this equation. Let's have a look at what it is that changes under stressful circumstances. When people become stressed, their attentional processes are no longer goal-directed. So when I'm relaxed, my goals, my aims, guide my attentional processes. So the things that I perceive and the way I interpret them are relevant for me to achieve my goal. So I'm more or less on the steering wheel of my attentional processes. When I get stressed, this shifts towards stimulus-driven attention. More or less like my attention is being hijacked by stimuli, by events in my surroundings, and it's no longer guided by my actions or by my aims, but much more by whatever is present and is pulling my attention. And my interpretation of those stimuli also change under stressful circumstances. So to give that a bit more police-like example, let's say in this situation where there's again an arrest situation, there's colleagues around, there seems to be some amount of control, so I'm expecting here that the stress is not that high, and under goal-driven attentional processes, the officer would be able to hear the communications of his colleagues that might be guiding his actions. He might experience that He's fixating the suspect here in an appropriate manner, and perhaps focusing on where to keep the hands or reaching for handcuffs, etc. Anything that helps him reach his goal, which probably is to solve this situation in a safe way for the officer himself, the colleagues, any bystanders, and the suspect himself. Let's see what this would look like if the situation is perhaps a bit more stressful. So let's assume there's no colleagues around, and there might be additional threats in the surroundings in this situation. So if this would stress the officer and he doesn't mitigate this stress response, the attention would shift from this goal-directed attention towards stimulus-driven attention, meaning perhaps that his attention is drawn by some screaming in the far back instead of radio communication with colleagues for backup, for example. Or he may interpret any movement of the suspect as threatening or an attempt to escape or an assault, for example. So both the perception of things that we perceive and the way we interpret them and the way we respond to them are changed under the stress response. To make this example even a bit more clear, we're posting another link in the questions box. And I would like you to watch this clip, and I'll give you some dispatch information before you start watching this. Our suspect here is the guy with the hoodie on. And this is in the city center of Utrecht, and his mother called police because she's aware that her son is suicidal and plans to be killed by a police officer, and left the house in a very distressed state. It is at this point not clear whether he actually has a weapon or not, but that's the dispatch information that the officers that will come to the scene in a bit have approaching the situation. The video will freeze at a certain point, and I would like you to think of what goal-directed attentional processes would look, goal-driven attention would look like in that moment, and what stimulus-driven attention looks like. But I'll come back to that after you watch the clip. So at the point where it freezes, what we see is that the suspect has his hand in a pocket, and it's not sure what he has there. We see two police officers with a line of fire and perhaps some colleagues in the back. And what I would like you to think about is if these police officers maintain their goal-driven attentional processes, what would they focus on that would help them control this situation? So what would their perception be like? Where would their attention be directed at, and perhaps also how they would interpret or try to interpret that situation. So let's first let's assume these police officers maintain their goal-driven attention. What would that look like? What would they perceive, and what would they think about that? And if you can give some answers to that in the questions box. But I'm unsure if that's coming through. So try to, for yourself, indicate just to get an understanding of what goal-driven attentional processes mean. If we move on to assuming that these police officers are stressed, and I wouldn't blame them for it, and this shift towards stimulus-driven attention takes place, what type of stimuli might be present in this situation that would hijack their attention instead of their goal-directed attention, and what's more stress-driven interpretation of those stimuli might take place? Again, just to get you an understanding of these responses and what we mean by this shift. It's unfortunate that we can't see your answers coming through, but I think it's a helpful exercise to go through by yourself as well. I'll move on to some evidence there is from police research that this shift to stimulus-driven attention takes place. We are distinguishing three aspects of stimulus-driven attention, which is the threat-related attention, So the stress influences what I perceive, where my attention is drawn to. The threat-related interpretation, how I interpret those stimuli and that information that I perceive, and my response tendencies, also affected by stress, how I tend to respond, or what my first inclination to respond would be. And from research by Nieuwenhuis and Audience, we found that the gaze behavior, so the things that police officers look at, changes under stressful circumstances. Also, we see that anxious police officers, or stressed police officers, when they are reloading their gun, they are turning their view away from the suspect, whereas under non-stressful circumstances, they stay focused on the suspect. So, two examples of how perception, how this attention changes when police officers are stressed. If we look into the interpretation under stressful circumstances, we see that police officers make more errors in their judgment whether a situation is threatening or not. So in the work of various authors, so this is a common finding, we see that should or not should decision is made incorrectly, because police officers don't seem to wait until they have the proper information, and they interpret that situation as threatening to begin with, and therefore incorrectly decide to shoot. Also, officers in stressful circumstances report incorrectly that they think that a suspect is armed, whereas the suspect is actually not. There's a question here.
It's a question. Eric asked whether there is, besides what Arno and Audience provided, has there been real-life research about attention or only research settings?
In a real-life setting of police officers, that would be a hard thing to do. We can't measure that during the action of police officers. So I'm also looking at who's with us in the room. As far as I know, there's no in-action, on-duty research on that, correct?
That would be really interesting, of course.
Yes, I agree with that as well, that it would be very interesting. But I also see some practical challenges with that. But thanks for the question. It's a good point. So these are more or less, these are experiments. In these experiments, the researchers have worked hard to make the scenarios for these experiments as realistic as possible, and using training forms that are also commonly used in police officers. So I hope that answers the question. So we see in research changes in attention, in interpretation, and also in response tendencies. So Renan et al. Found that if police officers are stressed, and they have to kick back an aggressor, their whole posture is a bit more in an avoidance way, so they lean back and they duck down. So we see more of a avoidance posture and a response tendency towards flooding the situation, perhaps. Also an indication that under stress we see different response tendencies, different posture than under non-stress circumstances. So it's not just our idea that this attention changes, but we have evidence that this is what happens when police officers are stressed. Let's move on to what things we believe to change under stress and what we focus on in the SHOTPROS project. It's about decision making and acting, or acting and decision making, because we are trying to get the point across that we believe these two cannot be set apart from each other. Perhaps when we talk about decision making and acting, we feel that we are making a decision first and then acting, whereas in reality these are really interlinked. They happen at the same time and they inform each other. Therefore, we prefer the term action. And I think it's time to do a small experiment to look at this interaction between decision making and action. I'll ask Lisanne as a volunteer, but I would like you behind your computer screen to join us in this experiment, because I think it will help you in understanding the next steps that I'll be trying to explain. And also it's fun. So I have 4 commands: thumbs up, thumbs down, point left, and point right. That's easy enough, right?
Easy enough.
So in the first step of this experiment, we'll make it easy, and let's ease you into this. I would like you, here Lisanne, and you watching, I would like you to repeat my command. So if I say thumbs up, you say thumbs up, and do as I say. So you say as I say, and you do as I say. So let's see if we can get a thumbs down.
Thumbs down.
Point left.
Point left.
Point right.
Point right.
Easy enough, right?
Yeah.
Let's make it a bit more interesting. I would like you to say as I say, but do the opposite. So when I say thumbs up, you'll say thumbs up, but you'll actually do thumbs down. Point left.
Point left.
Point right.
Point right.
You're doing well. Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
It's also for the people at home, so you can practice with the same, and then we see the effect of training. Sure, you practiced already. You're doing great. Let's make it even more interesting and see how we go if I ask you to do as I say, but say the opposite. So if I say thumbs up, you would say
Thumbs down.
exactly, and so you got this. So do as I say and say the opposite. Point left.
Point right.
Yeah, point left.
Point right.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs down.
Thumbs down.
Thumbs up.
Okay, thanks, Lisanne, for your. So you did better than last time. So well
That's
done.
true.
So, my guess is this was challenging for you if you went along with this this experiment, and it kind of illustrates how our cognitions now. Illustrated by what we say, and our actions are really interlinked, and if they are not compatible, then we're confused, and it's hard to say which one informs which one. So is my action informing my cognitions, or are my cognitions informing my actions? Hopefully you experience that a bit in this, this small experience. Traditional, when we looked at decision making and action, we found that the action part was most studied by human movement scientists, but they came to realize that it's not just about the body, but the body has a brain, so there's a connection there. The decision-making part of it has mainly been studied by cognitive scientists, and they, in recent years, discovered that the brain has a body. So these two are interlinked, and finally these two scientific disciplines are finding each other. And it's an interesting question, if you got confused in this experiment, which one was confusing which one? Was it the body confusing the brain, or the other way around? And this illustrates how these two aspects of decision-making and acting are intertwined, and we prefer to call it action. And in the conceptual model, we use these complex terms, and I don't necessarily want you to understand these terms. I will explain what I mean in a bit, of motor heuristics and then body choices. And what these really are simple rules of thumb to choose between behavioral options. So I have decision rules that help me decide whether I move forward or retreat, if I shoot or I don't shoot, for example. So I have simple rules of thumb that guide my behavioral options, or make me decide between behavioral options, that are useful when I have little time or I'm stressed. And they use both sensory motor input, so the bodily, physical information we have, and the cognitive information. And again, these can't be separated from each other because they inform each other and they help each other. We have another clip to illustrate that. I'll ask Lisanne to post a link. I'll first let you watch this clip in full. After that, we'll chop it up in two parts and I'll talk you through it. So I'll give you a chance to watch this video via the browser and then come back to me.
Okay. Politie! Politie! Wat het wapen! Schiet! Rot op! Rot op! Ah! Wat het wapen!
Schiet je met been. Einde casus. Dankjewel.
So this is a scene we took from one of the experiments in a different project, and what we see here is our local Amsterdam heroes, Gerard and Hans, also part of the SHOTPROS Consortium from the Dutch National Police. Now that we've seen the clip in full, I'll show you two segments of that, and it will be choppy via share screen, but that's not an issue in this case, just to see how we go in explaining these concepts. So the start of the scenario. So at this point, there's already been a lot of decision making, but this might be a crucial phase in the decision making process of how to act next. And my aim is to illustrate that it's not just cognitions that Gerard has here that guide his actions, but it's also the perception of the level of fear, in this case the shock knife, the distance between him and the aggressor, but also the speed with which he's able to increase this distance and the speed with which he's moving. The fact that he's quite fit and he's well trained will feed into this decision tree or these decision rules that he's using. And last but definitely not least, the fact that his hand is already on the weapon is also an example of sensory information that is helpful in making the decisions for his next actions, resulting in this further action. So hopefully this example helps to illustrate these multi-heuristics and body choices, but really rules of thumb in which I use the information from my body and from my brain to inform my next action. So we've outlined that stress changes things. And does that mean that we're lost and under stressful circumstances our performance will always suffer? We are simply not able to perform in stressful circumstances. Well, I hope we can all agree that the answer to that is no. And there's different entry points of trying to prevent these changes or make them less impactful on our performance. The first would be to mitigate the stress response itself and mitigate the consequences of that stress response, it being the shift in attentional processes. So if we train people to retain their goal-directed attention or to restore their goal-directed attention, that would be helpful in performing under stressful circumstances. And to, in training, make sure that people develop multi-heuristics and embodied choices, so rules of thumb that are helpful for them, that are simple enough to use under stressful circumstances as well. So these rules of thumb are still salient and usable under stressful circumstances. And it takes practice to develop these rules of thumb and to make sure that in training we guide this process of building helpful multi-heuristics and embodied choices would be a way to go to equip police officers to perform under stressful circumstances. This leads us to the conceptual model in full. We've addressed several parts of this, several components of this model already, but this is the full picture, in which we see that human factors such as personal factors, organizational factors, etc., influence the likeliness that a stress response will occur, that we define as this perceived discrepancy between demands and capacities. If we leave that stress response unmitigated, the shift from goal-directed processes to stimulus-driven processes will take place, and action will be affected by that. But if we are able to mitigate that stress response or the consequences of that, then we might be able to keep these goal-directed processes, and the impact on decision-making and acting will be less severe. And this model also gives us various entry points for training of police officers. To begin with, the extra mental effort that we can invest to, when we are stressed, to still try to maintain the goal-directed processes. So by investing, intentionally directing my attention towards what is helping my performance and towards goal-driven perception, would help maintain my performance under stressful circumstances. So in training, we could try to train police officers in enforcing goal-directed processing. So under stressful circumstances, they are able to maintain or restore the goal-directed processes, to inhibit, so to suppress or stop these stimulus-driven tendencies. So again, redirecting attention by suppressing these shifts towards stimulus-driven processes. And as a last way to invest extra mental effort would be to try to lower the stress response itself. So re-evaluating the situation, re-evaluating my own capacities, for example, or via breathing techniques or really trying to lower that stress response, so that this shift is less likely to occur anyway. So these are already 3 entry points for training. Additionally, we can in training make sure that the way we learn to decide and act, we build helpful multi-heuristic and embodied choices in police officers that are, again, salient and usable under stressful circumstances. And all in all, this would impact on the personal factors, particularly the skill of police officers and their uncertainty, or rather certainty or efficacy about their abilities. So that concludes our conceptual model in full, and I think we'll move on to the field experiments that we've already conducted, but there's a question before I do that.
Eric asked last time, I also asked if you make use of naturalistic decision making, in parentheses pattern recognition, or more of a rational slow approach like OODA.
There would be more the naturalistic approach, because these are the, I think in that approach, the link between cognition and action, and it is about action, perceiving my options to act, that would almost by default be this naturalistic approach, I'd say. And not the slow processes in which I first perceive, then select, weigh my options, and first have this step of cognition, cognitive decision making, and then proceed to action. Hopefully I illustrated it. To us, these two are really intertwined, and in action we can't really distinguish them, nor is there time for this sequential process of decision making. So again, I hope that answers the question. I'll hand over to Lisanne. She will talk us through the various field experiments that we have already conducted within SHOTPROS. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, so I will have the honor to talk to you a little bit about the VR experiments that we have done so far within SHOTPROS. Here I've provided you with an overview of the experiments, 3 of which were with VR and police officers. And first I would like to talk about the starting point that we took. These are the site visits. So with the site visits, our aim was to create an inventory and an overview of current training practices of the law enforcement agencies that are involved in SHOTPROS. So as you will probably know, we have I think 6 different law enforcement agencies from 5 different countries. Yeah. And so we wanted to look at what do these training curriculums look like on paper first. And to do that, we asked our law enforcement agencies within SHOTPROS to send us any training related documents they could possibly think of. And so, wait, my apologies, the presentation. Oh. Resume slideshow, right? All right.
There you are.
My apologies. So yeah, to do that, we received over, I believe it was 400 documents from our law enforcement agencies that described specifically training scenarios, explanation of training skills for police instructors. And here you can simply just see a list of all the documents that we've received, just to show that we've gathered a really nice overview of training practices on paper. But to take this a step further, we also visited our law enforcement agencies on site. We had 2 aims for this. One, to conduct interviews. These we did with police instructors to gather a really nice overview of what training methods they employ, what do they like about their training, but also to get a first understanding of how virtual reality training might already fit into that. Then we also interviewed, I called them coordinators. These are usually people that have some conceptual task for training, people that have a really good overview of the training curriculum. And we asked them what elements of trainings they employ at the moment, how long trainees get the time to train these specific elements in a year, all of this to see how virtual reality training might be able to enhance this. Next to these interviews, we also observed a lot of training practices. And here you can see an overview of the different elements or different categories of practices we observe, from car procedures to tactical training to self-defense training. And we were lucky enough to visit all these different LIAs, but while we did, we also saw trainees from different levels. So, for example, when we went to Berlin, we went to the police academy where we got to see police cadets train. I went to Bucharest in Romania, and there we saw special operations officers train. And for example, when we were in North Rhine-Westphalia, we had police instructors do their training. So with these site visits, we could get a really nice overview of the different trainee levels and look at very varying training elements. While we were doing these training practice observations, we were looking at different training criteria. I've listed them here for you. These are more didactical features that we know from literature and from previous experience that they make a good training. So we looked at these different things like, is model learning used? And if so, we rated them from on a scale from 1 to 3. 1 if it didn't occur, 3 if it did occur a lot. And here you can get an even further overview of the smaller elements that feed into these criteria. For example, maybe whenever I went to Campus Vester, we observed the training at the shooting range. Normally, obviously, you all know this, a shooting range is a very static environment. And to make this a little bit more realistic, a little bit more engaging for the police students that were training, they have the police students at the very end of the shooting range take their weapon apart. They had to place the weapon elements on the floor. They then had to run and take one part at a time to the front and run back and forth. To make this even more difficult, they had the lights flickering and they put a time cap on this whole sequence. So yeah, this was just a simple way of making this static shooting training, weapon handling training a little bit more engaging. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, one of our aims with these visits and with the document analysis was to identify overall training objectives that occur in all of these LIAs that we visited and we received documents of. And you can see the list of our objectives or training components that we've identified here. Please, if you come from another LIA and you have any other experiences, any other training components that are relevant and a large part of your training curriculum, please feel free to share that with us. We're obviously very interested in seeing whether there are differences in other law enforcement agencies. We will also get back to this particular list in a little bit more detail and in context of VR training in one of the experiments that I will be talking about. But to conclude our findings from the site visits, and this is nothing new. If you're a LIA and you have police instructors, involve them in the training. Just because now virtual reality training, you might want to involve that. Police instructors, they have such expertise, and when we talked to them, that became very clear. They already had really nice ideas of how to implement it. But as a first step, it is always very helpful to look at your own training curriculum and identify limitations of reality-based practices that are in place at the moment. With these limitations, you can check whether virtual reality might have advantages that can enhance this reality-based practice further. And then, as I mentioned, a lot about the different trainee level, and this is also something that police instructors already know and do, but it's important to adjust the training to the level of the trainees, as we will also see in one of our experiments. All right, this gets us to our first virtual reality training experiment. We got to do this one with Lisanne, also a project partner, our VR supplier, and the Dutch National Police, specifically the protection detail. And here, very basic, the first aim for us was to compare virtual reality training to reality-based scenario training. We wanted to do this on the basis of the stress that it can elicit, or the anxiety that police officers experience in the scenarios, and on the level of intensity. We also wanted to look at specifically the experience that trainees, well, in this case, police officers have in virtual reality. To do that, we tested over, I believe, 300 police officers. We've conducted this experiment this past January and February during the actual training days of the police. So this was, I would want to say, a very ecologically valid experiment because we involved our measures into the training that was taking part anyway. But here you can see the different training scenarios that the police officers underwent during the training days. So they had 4 training components, 3 of which were reality-based. So here you can see object protection, person protection, car transfer protection, and then a VR training scenario. In the VR training scenario, they put on the gear and they underwent multiple smaller scenarios that were somewhat similar to the object protection. So scenario might have looked like in the middle there was a large building, the officers were surrounding the building and had to scout different suspicious behavior. And I think it's back. All right. Yeah, so those were the scenarios that they did during the training days. Now, to assess the experience of the police officers in VR, we looked specifically at sense of presence. Sense of presence is the feeling of being there in a virtual environment. You could almost say the immersion. And to do this, we used the ITC Sense of Presence Inventory Questionnaire. So after the police officers were done training in virtual reality, we handed them iPads with a questionnaire. This sense of presence questionnaire specifically looks at 4 factors: spatial presence, which is basically the immersion in the space in the virtual environment, then the ecological validity or the naturalness of the virtual environment, the engagement that officers have with the virtual environment, and then obviously very important aspect, the negative effects or the adverse effects that officers might experience, such as obviously in this case, cyber sickness, motion sickness is a big topic, so we look at that as well. But when we do talk about sense of presence, it's quite important to note that sense of presence, if there's a high level of sense of presence, that alone doesn't make the training realistic. So we also want to look at the action possibilities that people might have in that virtual environment. So how well do the physiological responses, the stress responses, for example, and the actual behavior and movement correspond across a real-world task and a simulated version of the same task? So this is something to keep in mind, so that it's not, the focus isn't just of the experience in VR, because that might be really good experience, very high engagement with the virtual environment, but the movements and the actions might look very different from what we would look or what we would see when police officers train a reality-based scenario. Additional measures we employed were visual analog scales, and you can see an example of such a scale here. With this scale, we wanted to just have a simple check and have a subjective measure of the perceived level of stress or anxiousness that officers experience. This particular example is for the mental effort that officers exerted. You heard Vana talk about it in the human factors model. So we really wanted to make sure that we had also measured the mental effort to, correspond with the stress response a little bit. In addition, we wanted to have an objective measure. For this, we used the Sapphire performance system. I believe it was the BioHarness 3, which is a chest strap that you can see here in the pictures. So in the beginning of the day, we basically distributed these amongst the police officers to measure their heart rate, and on the little puck that goes on the side that you can see in the picture, that basically picks up movement-related information to go back to the level of intensity and measure that to compare between reality-based training and virtual reality training. Now we have a little clip just to show you what our police officers did during the experiment, and I think Vana might be posting this.
He's trying.
Vana's trying to post it. But basically you can see here, you can also watch this later, of course, but these are officers that are training in VR. This is their first time in virtual reality. So you can see that their movements are a little bit still cautious, maybe not as realistic as you would want them later to be. So here we would just recommend that they spend a little bit more of a familiarization period in VR to get more familiar with the movements and stuff.
Die auto's heen, hè? Is goed. Oh ja. Handen omhoog. Handen omhoog. Laat je handen zien. Laat je handen zien. Handen omhoog. Weg hier. Weg. Weg. Doorlopen. Oké. Zo is weg.
Vuurwapen! Vooruit!
Goed zo, Mehmet.
Oké, gaan we verder.
Ja, zo achter je.
Staat er 63 jongens?
Ja hoor. Hartstikke goed. Pakken. Hartstikke mooi.
Rechts eventjes.
Ja.
All right, I hope everybody had the chance to watch the video, but I hope that illustrated what we meant by sense of presence, but also at the same time looking at the action possibilities and the movements and the actions and the performance of the tasks. So we have some of the preliminary results here for you. Basically, when looking at sense of presence, we saw that for this particular training, police officers had really high levels of engagement with the virtual environment, but also the high levels of spatial presence. Interestingly enough, and that was probably something that we already expected, that there were very varying degrees of negative effects. So some of the officers, they could put on the gear, they would go into the scenario, and they had absolutely no issues. They could go through it and were immediately familiarized with how it worked. They had no issues. And then we had officers who went in and who actually had to stop and couldn't continue the VR training because they experienced negative effects. Also, we found that when people experience higher levels of sense of presence, they were generally also more anxious and they had to exert more mental effort. So conclusively, we would then say that if we set up a VR training, we would want to make sure that the system that we're using, the environment that is developed, this training scenario that is being used, can elicit a sufficient level of sense of presence. Because especially if you do want to train or want to put your officers under a certain level of stress, you want to make sure that sense of presence is fairly high, because as we've seen, when the level of sense of presence was higher, officers were more anxious and exerted more mental effort. And then again, we've already mentioned this as well. Make sure that the movements and the behaviors are somewhat similar to what you would expect and see in a reality-based training scenario. That gets us to our next study. This one was a VR training at home experiment, and quite interestingly, this happened, I think, during the first partial lockdown here in the Netherlands. It was past April. We did this together with the Dutch Police Academy. They had the issue that due to this lockdown and the regulations, they couldn't train their police officers. But at the same time, they were working on this danger zone virtual reality system, which is a single user system. So we took the opportunity to use this for trainees to keep them training at home. With this particular experiment, we wanted to look at whether the level of prior professional experience of students might have an impact, and whether the type of training instruction might influence the learning experience, the engagement that students had with the virtual reality training, and also the experience with and reception of virtual reality training, also in terms of what the instructors might think. Here's some background. So as I mentioned, during the lockdown, we had about 4 weeks where we conducted this experiment. We had about 40 police students and 14 instructors who tested the system. Each got the system for 2.5 days. And we asked the police students during these 2.5 days to perform 9 VR training sessions, each of which had to be about 20 minutes long. After they were done training, we asked them to fill in or rate their learning experience. And we also asked them to keep a training log of the actual minutes that they trained. For instructors, this was a little bit different. We asked them also to have the system for 2.5 days, but we let them experiment with the system. We didn't have any time frame on how often they needed to use it. After they were done using it, we did distribute a VR training evaluation form to them as well. And here in the table, you can see how we divided and separated the police students into assessment groups so that we could check where the level of experience and type of instruction might have an impact. So first, we distinguished students by the level of experience. So in this case, we had the less experienced students who basically just started out at the police academy. They had no practical training. Most of the training that they received at this point was theoretical, whereas the students that had received or that have more experience have already had some practical experience, specifically also with shooting on the shooting range. And then we further divided these groups based on the type of training instruction they received for the VR training. So students who received open instruction basically didn't have any guideline or restriction on what they should train. They were simply asked to train these 9 sessions in these 2.5 days. We had also students with the closed training instructions, and they had a more strict training plan. And you can see here examples of what that looked like. So, for instance, we asked them to train the first 3 training sessions at the beginner level of the virtual environments that they were in, and they had to complete each assignment successfully before they could move on to the next training session. So our preliminary results, specifically looking at the level of experience, we found that the more experienced students rated their learning experience significantly higher than the less experienced students. We also saw that the more experienced students spent a lot more time engaging training in the VR system than students who did not have any prior practical experience. So based on this, we can say that the VR training was a lot more beneficial in terms of the learning experience and the engagement with the VR system for students who had already received some prior practical experience. When we look at type of instruction, we saw that the students who had these open training instructions, so the instruction that didn't have any specific training program for them, they spent a similar amount of time training or engaging with the VR system, regardless of whether they had prior experience or they didn't have any prior experience. However, when we look at the closed training instructions, we could see that the more experienced students spent significantly more time training with VR. Not only that, but also the more experienced students that also received closed training instruction at the same time had the highest level of learning or had the highest rating of their learning experience and spent most time in training. Now, when we look at the instructor rating here, you should find something familiar as we just talked about the training objectives. Basically, we asked the police instructors who used the system to rate how useful they found VR for these training components that we've identified in the site visits. And here on the vertical axis, you can see the usefulness scale from 1 being not useful at all to 5 being very useful. And you can very clearly see that police instructors rated VR most useful for tactical training as well as law and regulation training, and least useful for, I believe, fitness training and combat training, which, you know, based on the inherent limitations and disadvantages that VR has, makes a lot of sense. Now, conclusively, based on these results, we can say that keep in mind this was just with a single user system in police students, but here, if you train police students with VR, you want to make sure that they have some practical prior relevant practical experience, and that they also, if you have students with this prior practical experience, that you provide them with closed training instructions, meaning that you have training plan that is in accordance with the skill level that they possess, and that shows them what they need to do in the VR training. And then lastly, based on the training instructions, it's quite important to choose the training components strategically, as some are more useful for VR than others. Here might also be noteworthy to mention that based on this list, they shouldn't be seen as singularities. We want to make sure that a training is more than just picking out, oh, we're doing weapon handling now. We want to make sure that multiple components are part of it. I don't know what's doing that actually.
I don't know either.
All right. That gets us to our last study. This one was very particular. Here we had 700 police officers that we tested. We did this one with the city police in Zurich and the VR provider called Refence. These partners were collaborating on this VR training and the training scenarios for quite a while. So during the training days that they've conducted this past, I think June and July, we were able to do some experiments with them. And here we really wanted to focus on a comparison of VR training to another technology-enhanced training practice, which in this case was the VIRTRA. So as you know, previously in the Twente study, we wanted to compare VR training to reality-based training practice. Here we wanted to look at how VR training would compare to a technology-enhanced training practice. Here we also wanted to look at the effect that a pain stimulus might have and the effect that the feedback features of the debriefing session that VR offers, we call it the VR after action review, has on the learning experience of police officers. So for those of you who might not know what the VIRTRA specifically is, you can basically imagine it to be a 300-degree multi-screen shooting cinema. I think the pictures illustrated quite well. For this study in particular, we had 2 officers training this at the same time, with one instructor who could play in the video to make it in accordance with what the trainees needed. And they could also control the feedback that they gave. So these were short sequences of videos that they trained in for the VIRTRA system. A little bit of background on the setup for this experiment. This was again during the training days, so the schedule was quite dictated by the Zurich police. But we had about 24 participants come in each day, and we selected or split them up into 3 groups, and then had them train the VR and the VIRTRA training. And after each of those, we again distributed questionnaires. You're probably already now familiar with the visual analog scales, again to assess the perceived level of stress and mental effort. We also assessed sense of presence. Again, we used the Sapphire performance system to measure their heart rate. And quite particularly in this study, we also assessed the quality of learning in each of these groups. So for quality of learning, I brought here a couple statements that the police officers rated after they were done with the training. So here we wanted to see how relevant was the training for the development of their skills that they would use during their duty, during on-the-job experiences that they will have in the future. Also, we had our partner from the AIT, the Austrian Institute of Technology, come in, who did some qualitative interviews with some of the participants and instructors to go a little bit more in depth of the experience, the benefits of a VR training. And now a little bit more specifically to the VR training setup that we had. As I mentioned, we had the VIRTRA training with 2 participants training at the same time. For the VR, we had 4 participants training at the same time. And what was different in this study was that they completed 1 large training scenario. In the Twente study, we had the officers do small, short sequences of scenarios, and here we did 1 large training scenario, which consisted of multiple layers. By that, I simply mean that in this case, it was a bank, so the officers had to go into the bank. There were multiple levels or floors, and each of the floor had a slightly different training objectives that they had to work through. The focus here was on de-escalation and tactical procedures. And then in addition to this setup, we also used the Stress X training belt. This basically is to add a pain stimulus. This elicits a small electrical impulse when somebody does get shot in the virtual environment or gets hit in some way, but the instructor or operator of the system has to do that manually. We basically, in the morning, when we distributed the chest straps to measure the heart rate, we also put on these Stress X belts. I would like to also talk a little bit in detail about the feedback features and why these are so important for VR. Obviously, in VR training, we have the option and the advantage that every single movement, every single action and task is recorded. So after we're done with the training scenario, we can go back and show our trainees, our students, our officers what they've done. And to take advantage of this to the most optimal level, we looked at the different features that it can provide. So for example, in the first week of the entire training, we had the instructors use the bird's eye view and the police officer's perspective with the sideline of the weapon turned on to show the officers what they've done. And for this, I have brought some pictures on the right-hand screen. You should be able to see in the first pictures. That's the bird's eye view, so you can see the entire environment from on the top. You can see the movements really well. And the green line that is on is the sideline of the weapon. So this is on, if we have the next week without the sideline, this would be turned off. And then in the second picture, you can see how a training was reviewed from the police officer's perspective. So you can go into the police officer and see the scenario and play it based on what they've viewed. Together with our colleagues from the AIT, again, our SHOTPROS partner from the Austrian Institute of Technology, we've been working on the quantitative analysis, and we have brought here some preliminary results. And we could see that for both the VR and the virtual training system, participants rated their quality of learning very high. There was no significant difference between the two, but the ratings were quite high. Again, both systems were also positively received. The difference that we could identify were for the VR that it was more immersive. The sense of presence that people or the officers experienced in the VR was a lot higher compared to the virtual, but the virtual had high technology acceptance, and it was a lot easier to use because you didn't really need any equipment. You could just start going to the environment. Quite interestingly here, the addition of a pain stimulus. So police officers who trained with the pain stimulus had higher levels of perceived stress, and they also exerted more mental effort. Also, when police officers trained with the pain stimulus, they rated their intention to use the VR training system in the future as higher. So if you want to make sure that your officers would like to train with VR, you can add a pain stimulus. Here we have some of the results from the interviews. These were also analyzed and conducted by the AIT. But here we can see the positive and the negative aspects of the VR system that was used during the Zurich study. I think quite interesting and obviously mentioned as a very strong suit of the VR was that scenarios resembled real places in Zurich. And here the Refense AG, they did a really good job because whenever the officers put on their gear and they went into the first time into a virtual environment, they basically replicated the training routes that the officers would train in real life. So the first exposure to the virtual environment was immediately a training route that was familiar with the officers, so they didn't have to, get used to an entirely new environment and navigate that. So that was a strong suit. But similarly, when they started the training scenario, they replicated the Paradeplatz in Zurich, which is a very popular, famous square in Zurich that all police officers know. So here again, this is a huge advantage of the VR training that we have. We can replicate places that we could not normally train in. Like, I don't think they could simply say at the Paradeplatz in Zurich that they're going to conduct the training here now. So it's really nice that we have the option to replicate that in VR. The negative aspects here, weapon handling. For this experiment, we used the generic weapons. They will later be replaced with more realistic weapons. And one of the most mentioned things was, again, the interaction with objects, with non-playing characters and team members. So this is something that needs to be worked on. We often had the problem that based on the sound, we couldn't tell how far away our team members were. Also, the interaction of the non-playing characters, the avatars in VR, the gestures, the facial expressions, it's quite hard to read that and navigate that. So these are things that are still to be improved. So based on these results, we can say that if you want to train in VR and put trainees under a certain level of stress, you can do that and enhance that by adding a pain stimulus. I think this inherently is obvious, but it's quite important to make use of these after action review feedback moments that we have. This is something that we don't have in real life training, so we should really make sure that we take advantage of this. And lastly, usually all police instructors know this, so this is probably also nothing new, but we want to allow scenario repetitions. VR does provide this as well. In Zurich, we had the schedule that was really tight, so we had the police officers go into the VR training scenario. They went through that, they got their after action review, and then they had to move on to the next training station. And I think one of the things that I heard most from them was that now I know what I did wrong, I know what I can improve, and I know how to do it, so let me go back in and do it again. VR offers that, so we really want to make sure that we take advantage of that as well. Yeah, I think this sums up the experiments that we've done so far. Again, we're looking at VR compared to reality-based practice, compared to technology-enhanced practice, and also what a single-user VR system at home could provide. Right now, we're still working on some of the physiological response results. So if you're interested in that, please continue to follow SHOTPROS, and I think the results will be out there soon enough. And yeah, I think if there's time for questions, if there are questions, we have time for that now. I also want to mention, please feel free to contact us if you have any other input, recommendations, questions. Our email addresses are there, and I don't think you or I mind to get some more emails.
So that would be nice if there are questions to interact a bit more. There's two questions that we didn't address as we went from Eric again that I want to pick up on to get those answered as well. Perhaps it's best to start with one relating to the training components you presented. And the question basically is whether we have decision-making training as a separate component in this list of components. My view on this, and we've had a lot of discussion with the different LIAs on this, these are categories of types of training, but there's always common factors in that. So if you want to train combat skills that can be used under stressful circumstances, then introducing stress would be a part of that. So there are overarching aspects of training as well, and I think decision making is one of those overarching components. So within combat skill training, within tactical training, within communication training, there will be this element of training, decision making, and action. So it is not listed as a separate component, but this is something that goes through all the training components. The Swedish police mentioned that in all their training components, they have this aspect of reflection that all officers need to be aware that they have limitations. They're human, so there are constraints to their performance, and that would be something that is repeated throughout different training components, and that would be true for decision making and action. This would be a part within all these different components, and to structure this in a logical way, how to call the components, how to have these overarching factors of training within. Perhaps we should think of how we can illustrate that best to make that clear that some aspects are present in all these different components. And the reason why Eric specifically asked for decision-making training was that it is shown in research by Terry Wollard that VR and Fletch is most useful for that decision-making. So I get where the question is coming from. Another question Eric asked prior, and that was related to the embodied choices and the motor heuristics, was whether we then took cognitive biases into account. And if you can follow along our idea of action, in which cognition and motor sensory input is intertwined, then it would be impossible to leave out these cognitive biases, particularly if you realize how fast these interpretations followed by action and action informing our interpretations are. And I think the trick, so to speak, would be to make sure that within these motor heuristics, this rule of thumbs, we have helpful biases, because we can't act fast enough without any simplifying of reality. And that's what these simple rules of thumb outline, that there's simpler decision rules than going through the whole spectrum of possibilities and have these slow processes in weighing pros and cons of different choices, etc. So we need these fast responses, and therein will be cognitive biases, and the trick is to make sure we have cognitive biases that are helpful and that are not hindered or are not steering us in the wrong direction under stressful circumstances. So I hope that kind of links to our the debate we're having here on how fast and slow processes are considered in our project. Let's see if we have some additional questions. There may be. Manfred is saying great job. That's always nice to hear. Thank you, Manfred. And Eric is saying, I'd like to ask a lot more because the webinar is great. Thank you both. Well, thank you for your interesting question, Eric, and your engagement with us. That's really helpful when we're presenting and there's questions coming back and forth. And it's nice to have an expert like yourself here on board on the webinars and provoking nice questions here. I guess for now, at least, that seems to conclude the questions part. Perhaps we can allow a little bit more time if people would like to think of a question and would like to place that in the questions box. At least we will be around to answer questions that may pop up. But I think for the presenting part, this would sum up our webinar. Thanks all for attending this webinar. It's been a pleasure to introduce you to both the model and the findings we've learned so far from the field studies. A special word of thanks to all the police parties that we were able to collaborate with throughout the field studies. That's been amazing.
Really
interaction that we've had. So many thanks for that.
Yes, I think that is one of the most important parts for us to, as researchers, to go in and see what they're doing, so that we're not just looking at this through the scientific lens, but that we also, have really close interaction. So thank you to everyone who has been a part of that. It's been really nice.
And from the looks of it, there's no more questions. So I guess we'll stop broadcasting. Here you know how it works.
Maybe.
Yeah.